What if I told you that humanity's greatest threat isn't climate change, nuclear war, or even runaway AI, but instead something more stealthy?
What did you say?
Around the globe, populations are quietly shrinking, setting the stage for an economic shockwave unlike anything we've ever seen. So today, we're breaking down exactly why demographic decline matters, what's causing it, how it's beginning to reshape the financial system, and what all of this means for your future. My name is Guy, and believe me, this is a video you simply cannot afford to miss. Now, first things first, you need to know that nothing in this video is financial or investment advice. It's educational content intended to inform you about demographics and the effects they could have on the economy and the markets. And if this is the kind of content you want to get more of, then smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ping that notification bell. Now, when it comes to human history, the idea of endless growth feels almost ingrained in us. After all, it wasn't long ago we were hearing stories of an impending population bomb, fears that the planet would soon become overcrowded and its resources stretched to breaking point. Well, as it turns out, those fears missed something critical. The real crisis facing humanity isn't endless growth, it's the exact opposite. Populations around the globe are shrinking faster than most of us realize, and the data paints a startling picture. According to projections from institutions like the European Commission and renowned medical journals like The Lancet, the global population is set to peak sooner and lower than previously thought. Forget reaching 12 billion people by 2100. New estimates suggest we'll peak at around 9.7 billion by the 2060s and start declining sharply from there. And that might sound surprising until you consider what's already happening on the ground. Japan has been the proverbial canary in the coal mine, experiencing a decline in population for decades. Birth rates in places like South Korea are also shockingly low, currently standing at around 0.72 births per woman. Italy, Spain, and other European countries aren't far behind, with fertility rates consistently below 1.4. Even China, which until recently was the world's most populous country, is now shrinking. Now, for context, the birth rate required to keep a population growing is approximately 2.1 children per woman, the so-called replacement rate. And while populations are still increasing in certain regions, like sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia, in the grand scheme of things, it isn't long until they too begin to experience demographic declines. What's clear right now, though, is that the West in particular is in big trouble. But what's causing this unprecedented collapse in population growth? Well, first, there's economics. Simply put, having children has become prohibitively expensive. Housing, childcare, education, and healthcare costs have soared beyond the reach of average families. The United States recently reported the average cost of raising a child to adulthood as exceeding $310,000. Meanwhile, real wages have barely moved for decades, even as living costs have been surging year over year. It's little wonder fewer people feel financially secure enough to raise families. And speaking of modern lifestyles, another reason behind falling populations is social isolation. People simply aren't forming relationships and families like they used to. Surveys reveal that around half of Americans report having fewer than 3 close friends, and more than 10% have no close friends at all. Community bonds, once central to relationships and family formation, have largely dissolved, replaced instead by digital connections that leave many feeling disconnected and lonely. Social media's impact on relationships can't be overstated. While it seemingly expands our social circles, the reality is that it's made relationship building harder, not easier. Today, you're not just competing with the people in your local area, you're competing with everyone on the planet. This unprecedented competition pressures individuals to constantly seek something or someone better, further eroding long-term relationships. Shifts in gender roles and increased workforce participation have also reshaped family dynamics. While these changes have brought long overdue social progress, they've also had unintended economic consequences. 2 incomes became necessary where previously 1 was sufficient, placing immense financial and emotional strain on working parents. And finally, uncertainty about the future is deterring more and more people from starting families. Concerns about the environment, economic instability, and societal pessimism, often amplified by social media and sensationalist mainstream media, have created widespread anxiety about the viability of raising children in today's world. But what does this demographic decline mean for your financial future? Well, the uncomfortable truth is that our entire financial system fundamentally depends on continuous population growth, especially things like pensions. Think about it. Pensions rely on younger workers paying into the system today to fund retirement benefits for older generations. Now, this arrangement works fine as long as there's a steady influx of younger workers. But what happens when this younger population starts shrinking substantially? If you've watched our video on pensions, you'll already know that pension schemes worldwide, from Europe and the US to Japan, essentially operate like giant Ponzi schemes. Governments have already spent most of the pension contributions that today's retirees paid in decades ago. These pension systems depend entirely on new generations of workers contributing each year in order to sustain payouts. But here's the problem. With declining populations and fewer new workers entering the workforce, governments face a difficult choice. They could drastically raise taxes on the shrinking workforce, risking severe economic backlash, or they could drastically cut pensions for retirees, potentially triggering enormous social unrest. So instead, many governments quietly turn to stealth tactics, such as financial repression and mass immigration. Now, financial repression essentially involves holding interest rates artificially below inflation levels, eroding your savings purchasing power over time. An invisible tax that enables governments to take on more debt to manage these ballooning pension liabilities without openly defaulting. And this isn't some distant possibility, it's already happening. Take Japan, for instance. Japan currently has the world's oldest population, with more retirees than active workers. Pension obligations are soaring, and public debt has reached well over 250% of GDP. Unable to significantly raise taxes or slash pensions without risking social turmoil, the Japanese government is increasingly resorting to financial repression, quietly transferring wealth from savers to the government by rapidly inflating away the currency and the value of social obligations like pensions. But if you think Japan is unique, think again. Europe and North America are on remarkably similar trajectories, merely delayed by a few years. Meanwhile, another strategy increasingly used by Western governments has been to rely on immigration as a temporary fix, bringing in younger workers from abroad to help sustain the pension Ponzi scheme for just a little longer. However, immigration as a strategy to manage demographic decline isn't straightforward. An increasing reliance on immigration to sustain pension systems has begun to trigger significant political backlash. Public resentment towards immigration policies has surged across countries worldwide, fueling political polarization and the growth of nationalist movements. Many European governments are now struggling to balance economic necessity with social stability, as voters increasingly resist immigration-driven policies. So then, how else can governments maintain pension payouts? Well, unfortunately, the answer is simply more debt. Governments issue bonds to fund pension liabilities, continually kicking the problem down the road. But issuing bonds means governments need buyers for those bonds. Without enough willing buyers, governments are forced to pressure banks, pension funds, and insurance companies into buying these bonds, often at yields lower than inflation, yet another form of financial repression. But perhaps even more concerning is the potential impact on asset prices, and particularly in the stock market. Today's pension funds are heavily invested in stocks, often passively through automated index funds, which buy regardless of price. Now, this price-insensitive behavior has earned them the nickname large mindless robots. And with a shrinking pool of young workers, pension funds experience reduced inflows, eventually slowing or even reversing the massive streams of money historically flowing into large stock indexes. Over time, major stock markets, heavily dependent on continuous growth, consumer spending, and these inflows, could face severe downward pressure. And falling asset prices mean shrinking pension payouts, potentially triggering economic pain for the millions of retirees who depend on these investments. But while this scenario might sound grim, it's also quietly setting the stage for a remarkable shift: the rotation of economic power from capital back to labour. But first, some context. For decades, the global economy has been firmly in the hands of capital. That is, big investors, major corporations, and the ultra-wealthy. Their dominance came from an abundant labour supply, globalised markets, and the ability to outsource work to wherever it was cheapest. But what happens when the endless supply of cheap labour suddenly starts to disappear? Well, to understand this, let's quickly recap how we got here. For the last several decades, corporations have leveraged globalisation to keep wages suppressed. Factories moved abroad, labour markets became global, and corporations extracted huge profits by paying the lowest possible wages. Workers had little bargaining power, and wages barely budged in real terms, even as productivity soared and corporate profits reached unprecedented highs. But now, demographic collapse is fundamentally changing this dynamic. Fewer births mean fewer young workers entering the workforce. At the same time, baby boomers, once the core of the labour market, are retiring in record numbers. Suddenly, corporations find themselves competing fiercely for fewer available workers. And this phenomenon isn't theoretical either, it's already unfolding in real time. Take Japan again, for instance. Due to severe labour shortages driven by its ageing population, wages there have surged dramatically. Recently, some Japanese companies increased salaries by nearly 10% in a single year. Employees who switched jobs gained raises averaging over 40%. And companies aren't doing this out of generosity, they're doing it to survive. They have no choice but to pay up or risk losing their workforce. But Japan is just the beginning. Similar trends are quietly emerging across developed nations in Europe and North America. After decades of wage stagnation, employees in many Western countries now have increasing leverage in the job market. This leverage is also why many Western nations have recently accelerated immigration policies, hoping to mitigate labour shortages. Yet immigration is no longer the easy solution it once was. Major outsourcing hubs, China and India, are now facing their own demographic challenges, further shrinking the global labour pool. Companies can no longer simply move production overseas or bring in cheap labour from abroad without running into demographic walls elsewhere. So, what about automation and AI, the so-called silver bullets corporations are desperately counting on? Well, while artificial intelligence and robotics may eventually reduce the need for human labour, current technologies are nowhere near advanced enough to meaningfully replace the complex roles many workers fill. This is why corporations now face a difficult choice: adapt to higher wages or face shrinking operations and declining profits. Decades of capital dominance conditioned them to prioritize profits above all else. But now, sustaining profits requires investing heavily in their workforces and providing better wages, conditions, and benefits. And once labour scarcity becomes the norm, the old playbook of suppressing wages no longer works. Higher wages become entrenched, shifting power firmly back to workers for an extended period. In other words, demographic collapse is inadvertently levelling the economic playing field for labour in ways we haven't seen in generations. But this shift doesn't last forever. As wages rise, family formation becomes financially viable again. Higher salaries mean more families can afford children, potentially reversing some demographic decline. At the same time, though, increased family formation temporarily tightens labour markets further as parents, especially women, exit the workforce to raise families. This creates a feedback loop. Rising wages encourage family formation, further labour shortages drive wages even higher, until eventually labour markets rebalance and stabilise. At that point, economic power may slowly rotate back to capital, completing the cycle. However, while the economic pendulum is now clearly swinging back towards labour, these major shifts unfold gradually, taking decades to fully materialise. We're still only in the early stages of this transition, meaning it may be many years before we truly emerge from this demographic crisis and achieve a stable new equilibrium. Which brings us to the all-important question: can the current financial system adapt to this profound demographic shift? Well, to answer this, we need to take a closer look at what the current financial system is based on: capitalism. Throughout its history, capitalism has proven remarkably resilient, consistently adapting to disruption, reinventing itself in the face of every new crisis, and emerging stronger each time. But the demographic storm we're entering today is unlike any challenge capitalism has faced before. As you might know, capitalism fundamentally thrives on growth. Continuous expansion requires more workers, more consumers, and an ever-growing market. With global populations shrinking, we're losing this crucial engine of economic prosperity. Unlike past economic downturns, such as financial crises, inflationary episodes, or recessions, this demographic shift is structural, long-term, and profoundly different. Additionally, many modern corporations, especially large tech giants, have gradually moved away from genuine innovation towards a rent extraction model known as techno-feudalism. Companies like Apple, Google, and Amazon increasingly generate profits not from groundbreaking innovations, but from dominating markets and extracting rents due to their sheer scale. Now, this approach worked effectively when populations and markets were expanding steadily, hiding fundamental stagnation behind impressive short-term profits. But without demographic growth, these companies face a stark new reality. They must innovate meaningfully or risk prolonged stagnation. And beyond corporate dynamics, the demographic shift profoundly reshapes consumer behaviour. Aging populations don't just spend less overall, they spend differently. Older consumers typically reduce discretionary spending, shifting their expenditures towards essentials such as healthcare, pharmaceuticals, and retirement-related services. This structural shift in consumer demand directly challenges businesses built around traditional consumption growth models. Then there's the issue of productivity. Historically, rising productivity has offset declining population growth, enabling continued prosperity despite demographic headwinds. Yet today, productivity growth in many developed nations has stalled significantly. Ironically, the slowdown in productivity growth coincides precisely with a period when transformative innovations are needed the most. Moreover, the demographic shift exacerbates another structural economic vulnerability: consumer debt. As real wages stagnate and living costs soar, households increasingly rely on credit. Total consumer debt has already reached record highs, exceeding $18 trillion in the United States alone, with credit card debt surpassing $1 trillion. Many families now depend on debt simply to cover daily expenses, from groceries to housing. And a shrinking consumer base and declining workforce make this debt increasingly unsustainable, further threatening economic stability. In fact, we actually have an entire video on consumer debt, which you can find right over here. But again, capitalism has proven adaptive in the past. So, to survive this unprecedented demographic storm, capitalism must once more fundamentally reinvent itself. Governments may need to rethink their policies, shifting towards initiatives explicitly designed to support families and stabilize demographics, such as affordable housing, better childcare, healthcare reform, and parental leave. Regulators, meanwhile, might aggressively tackle monopolistic market structures and rent-seeking practices, redirecting corporate incentives towards genuine innovation rather than mere extraction. And this all puts capitalism itself at a historic crossroads. If it successfully adapts again, the system could emerge stronger, fairer, and more sustainable. But if not, we may face prolonged economic stagnation, instability, and even deeper social and political challenges, reshaping societies, economies, and lives worldwide. And rather than passively waiting to see how things unfold, it's essential that you proactively prepare for the new demographic and economic reality. But what does this shift actually mean for you personally, and how should you position yourself? Well, first and foremost, it demands a shift in your mindset. The next decades will look fundamentally different from what we've known before. The conditions that previously allowed a select few to thrive are rapidly changing. We're now entering an era shaped by labour shortages, rising wages, and a profound shift in economic power dynamics. As we discussed earlier, this shifting balance between capital and labour directly impacts your leverage as a worker. With fewer workers entering the workforce, companies must increasingly compete to attract and retain skilled talent. This gives you significantly greater bargaining power than you've likely had before. Understanding your increased value and positioning yourself accordingly is crucial to thriving in this new reality. This means your career strategy may need an upgrade. Actively invest in yourself through continuous education, training, and skill development, particularly within industries projected to face significant labour shortages. But successfully navigating this demographic shift isn't only about individual careers. It also creates opportunities for strategic investments. When workers gain more economic power, certain sectors naturally outperform others. Companies that attract talent by offering competitive wages, supportive family policies, and flexible working conditions will likely become stronger, benefiting from higher productivity, lower worker turnover, and sustained success. Additionally, governments worldwide increasingly recognize that supporting family formation is essential to economic stability. As they respond with targeted policy measures such as affordable housing, improved education, healthcare services, and elder care, sectors aligned with these policies could see substantial investment and growth. Beyond investing in specific sectors, geographical diversification also becomes crucial in this new demographic landscape. Population decline isn't uniform worldwide. Some countries and regions will navigate this transition far more successfully than others. Nations proactively supporting family formation, strategically managing immigration, and maintaining balanced demographics are likely to outperform those facing severe demographic challenges. So, diversifying your investments across multiple regions helps mitigate risks concentrated in any single economy, protecting your long-term financial stability. Additionally, embracing active portfolio management becomes essential. As we've discussed, many pension systems today are heavily invested in stock markets, often passively through index funds. As more people retire and fewer new workers contribute, inflows into major stock indexes will inevitably slow, creating potential downward pressure on large cap indexes. Now, this doesn't mean you should immediately sell your tech stocks or drastically reposition your entire portfolio. Remember, demographic shifts unfold over many years, and any major market repricing isn't likely to happen overnight. So instead, carefully evaluate sectors clearly positioned to benefit from this long-term demographic shift. And finally, strategic financial planning is critical. Clearly understand your own long-term financial needs, especially in terms of pensions, retirement, and wealth preservation. With traditional pension systems under enormous stress, it's prudent to clearly plan for multiple financial scenarios, including ones where government-provided pensions fall short. So, diversifying your investments and saving strategy, considering alternative retirement solutions, and ensuring flexibility in your financial plans will greatly enhance your long-term security. While the economic landscape we're entering may be unfamiliar, by positioning yourself strategically, staying adaptable, and remaining informed, you can clearly transform uncertainty into opportunity. Because even in times of great change, knowledge truly is power. And if you're curious about how governments might handle their looming pension crises and what it means for your financial future, we have a video covering exactly that right over here. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, you can do so right over here. Okay, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again very soon. This is Guy, signing off.